Self-defense is not just some legal concept. It is not just a gift from the government. The right to defend yourself is a basic and fundamental human right. It is a right that you have, that I have, and that Merle Rausch has. It is a right that he exercised on June 15th, 2021, when he felt that his life was in danger. Merle's actions that night were not only lawful, they were reasonable. William Jones was a bully who was looking for a fight. He was bigger and stronger than Merle, an intimidating presence. Merle tried to disengage every time Jones confronted him. He even left the bar that night. But Jones followed him. He lunged at Merle, and Merle thought he had a knife, so he protected himself. What the state is asking you to do is to convict this man, Merle Rausch, of murder. But the evidence shows that he acted in self-defense when he shot his aggressor, William Jones. No one is disputing the fact that it is tragic that Mr. Jones is no longer with us. However, if Merle hadn't acted, he would likely be the one who lost his life that night. Let's go through the elements of the murder charge against Merle. To find Merle guilty, you must believe beyond a reasonable doubt, A, that in Jefferson County, Kentucky, on or about the 15th day of June 2021, he killed William Jones by shooting him with a firearm. No one is disputing this fact, not even the defense. B, that in doing so, he caused the death of William Jones intentionally and not while acting under the influence of an extreme emotional disturbance. Again, this is a fact that we have acknowledged. C, that he was not privileged to act in self-protection. Here's where your decision lies. You cannot find Merle guilty unless he was not privileged to act in self-defense. We have proven that Merle acted in self-protection that night, that this is a case about self-defense against a bully who was not going to leave without a fight. The evidence shows that Merle never wanted a fight. In fact, the evidence shows that Merle did everything in his power to avoid a fight. He left the bar after being harassed by Jones, and Jones stalked him before eventually lunging at him. Merle believed very reasonably that his life was in danger and did what he had to do to protect himself. The prosecution has not offered a single eyewitness who knows what was being argued about. No one saw or heard the altercation between Merle and Mr. Jones. No one has direct knowledge of what took place between them except Merle. Freddie Martin couldn't see from his porch. Officer Connor wasn't there. Merle was the only one present that can tell you what happened. And Merle's testimony has been further corroborated by Finley Williams. On June 15, 2021, Merle Rausch worked his regular noon to 8 p.m. shift at the local A&P food store, stocking shelves and doing cleanup. He got paid that day and cashed his check at the store like he did every 2 weeks for the last 8 years. After work, he walked about a mile to the Red Apple, his favorite neighborhood spot, where he planned on relaxing after a full week of work. When he got there, around 8:30 p.m., he noticed Mr. Jones was already there. Now, Jones had been harassing Merle, accusing him of stealing money a week before. Merle continued to tell him this night, like he had the week prior, that he hadn't taken his money. Merle's denial, just like it had the week before, made Mr. Jones very angry. Mr. Jones made several remarks to Merle, including, "Let's settle this outside." Merle decided to leave around 11 p.m. in an attempt to get away from Mr. Jones and to de-escalate the situation. Jones was much bigger and much stronger than Merle. He was around 6'4" and weighed around 200 pounds. Compared to Merle's 5'6", 140-pound stature, Jones was quite an intimidating presence. Feeling uneasy about the conflict, Merle walked out of the bar and started to head home. He didn't get very far when he noticed Mr. Jones following him, yelling things like, "Let's settle this, you little creep, and you've had it coming." Merle was starting to get scared. Jones was twice Merle's size and gaining on him. On top of that, he knew Mr. Jones to carry a knife. He told Jones that he didn't want to fight and continued to back away. But Jones kept coming closer and closer, and finally, when he was about 3 feet away, Jones lunged at Merle with his hands. Merle, justifiably fearing for his life, pulled out his gun and shot Jones. He shot Jones one time and one time only. He didn't set out to kill Mr. Jones that night. He didn't even set out to get into a fight or any type of altercation whatsoever. He went to his favorite hangout after a long week at work to kick back and enjoy himself, and he was attacked by a violent bully twice his size. You heard from Merle himself this exact series of events. You heard from Finley Williams, who echoed Merle's description of Mr. Jones's demeanor. He had a reputation as a bully. He was known for starting fights, especially when he was drinking, which is exactly what happened on the night in question. You also heard from Dr. Sidney Burns, who testified that the bullet that hit Mr. Jones went in at an angle, from his upper chest to his lower back. This is proof that Jones was lunging at Merle, who was much shorter than Jones, just like he described. Dr. Burns wasn't our witness. Dr. Burns was a witness for the state. This evidence came straight from the prosecution. Now, the prosecution would like you to focus on the police report and testimony provided by Officer Taylor Connor. But Officer Connor wasn't there until after the altercation took place. They would like for you to focus on the testimony of Nikki Felton, but Mr. Felton wasn't there when it happened either. The testimony that he gave shows that he wasn't aware of the substance of the argument. He stated specifically that he did not know what Merle and Mr. Jones were arguing about, and that he tried not to pay attention. He testified further that he witnessed Jones follow Merle out of the Red Apple Tavern. This shows that Jones was the initial aggressor. The prosecution would also like for you to focus on the testimony of Freddie Martin, but Mr. Martin couldn't see from his porch, and he was too far away to hear anything of substance. Mr. Martin was sitting outside his house in the dark a block away. He testified that he saw a large man following a short man. This is yet another prosecution witness testifying that Jones was following Merle. But the only person that can tell you specifically what happened outside of the Red Apple Tavern that night is Merle Rausch. His testimony is that he defended himself against a violent bully who was attacking him, and the evidence proves this to be true. Merle's self-defense claim does not hinge on the fact that Mr. Jones actually had a knife. It is wholly and completely dependent upon whether Merle reasonably believed that Mr. Jones posed a threat of serious injury or death to him. Merle testified that he knew Jones to carry a knife. He had physically seen him with it at the Red Apple Tavern. This led Merle to believe that the knife was something Jones carried regularly. So when Jones lunged at Merle, after threatening him, stalking him, and harassing him weeks prior even, on a dimly lit street that night, Merle reasonably feared that Jones was going to attack him with his knife. The altercation between Merle and Mr. Jones took place at 11 p.m. on a portion of Clark Street that had hardly any streetlights. The combination of the darkness and Merle's genuine fear of Mr. Jones and what he might do would have made it very difficult for Merle to focus on whether Mr. Jones had the knife in his hand when he lunged at Merle. Merle's protection of himself became instinctive, and he reacted by pulling the trigger. Now, there are discrepancies in the distance between Merle and Mr. Jones when the shooting took place. Merle's testimony is that Jones was around 3 feet away from him when he took the shot. This was corroborated by Freddie Martin in his statement to Officer Connor the night of the shooting. He stated that Merle and Jones were a few feet apart. Mr. Martin later changed his story, stating that he thought the two were around 10 feet apart. However, any statement made by Mr. Martin should be taken with a grain of salt. He was about 100 feet away and it was dark. The distance between Merle and Mr. Jones when the shot went off should not even hold much weight. The evidence has shown that Jones was following Merle, stalking him, continuing to threaten and harass him. The distance between the two was closing. And again, Dr. Burns told you that the trajectory of the bullet was angled in a way that shows Jones was lunging at Merle, who was shorter than him. When this happened, the ability to ascertain whether Jones had his knife was incredibly difficult. The fact that Jones ended up not having his knife does not defeat Merle's self-defense claim. This claim requires only that Merle believed that he needed to use deadly force to prevent death or serious injury. Merle shot Mr. Jones. He believed this to be the only way to protect himself in that moment. He took one shot and one shot only. He wanted to stop the attack. He protected himself before he lost the ability to protect himself altogether. I said it when this trial started, and I'll say it again one last time. This is a case about a bully who was looking for a fight and a man who was defending himself. What happened in this case is a tragedy, but only you can keep this one tragedy from turning into two. Your verdict can only say, loud and clear, that Merle Rausch is not guilty.